These glowing nodes illustrate the core architecture of a lived experience recovery organization, or LERO. Unlike traditional institutions, these environments are built natively on shared adversity, relational empathy, and a deeply grassroots culture. In their early stages, these organizations operate organically. High flexibility and deep established trust between peers drive immediate, effective recovery outcomes. That initial success inevitably attracts attention and funding. This triggers the scaling paradox. To grow, the LERO is forced to integrate with larger institutional frameworks and public commissioners. External institutions operate differently. They apply heavy pressure on the LERO to adopt traditional, risk-averse corporate architectures, rigid reporting, strict hierarchies, and standardized human resources policies. The mechanisms required to mature and secure funding act in direct opposition to the organization's native operations. Institutional integration threatens to dismantle the exact grassroots culture that made the organization successful in the first place. This animation maps the structural divide. On the left, we see the culture of lived experience, often referred to as an Ubuntu approach, competence-based, organic, and communal. On the right is standard corporate hierarchy, rigid schedules, top-down directives, and a reliance on external validation. During scaling, these two opposing structures are forced to integrate. The resulting overlap creates a high-friction zone where communal empathy collides with rigid compliance. For frontline staff caught in the middle, this environment produces immediate chaos. Left unchecked, risk-averse bureaucracy will systematically colonize the lived experience culture. The organic connections are overwritten by rigid procedures until the organization becomes indistinguishable from the institutions it was meant to provide an alternative to. Preserving a LERO is not achieved by hiring better staff. It requires the active engineering of specific systemic boundaries to keep the bureaucracy from consuming the culture. To understand how to protect this environment, we rely on the systemic model, a foundational blueprint for mapping exactly how an organization scales recovery capital. We start at the center, the vulnerable individual in adversity. As they heal, they rebuild support systems, mapped here as the family. The final layer is the professional environment, the LERO itself, where they begin to help others. For this structure to remain authentic, the culture of lived experience must flow continuously from the center node outward to the final ring. The empathy developed in adversity dictates the rules of the workplace. The outermost edge of that final ring represents a critical perimeter. It is the exact point where the organization meets the outside institutional world. A LERO's survival depends entirely on defending these expanding rings of recovery capital against outside interference. At that outer boundary sits the people and culture lead. In a scaling LERO, this HR role operates as a human shield between the inner culture and external forces. Look at the pressure. Institutional funders enforce procedures, policies, and risk compliance downwards. Simultaneously, grassroots staff drive the mission upwards with lived experience and heart. The culture lead is trapped at this intersection, generating intense emotional labor and anxiety. The threat increases when external partner organizations, which we can classify as petty tyrants, enter the ecosystem. These NHS-adjacent bodies often project their rigid safeguarding mentalities onto the LERO. Consider a documented incident. A vulnerable individual arrives at a LERO's front door seeking help. A subcontracted partner intercepts the interaction and immediately escalates it into a clinical safeguarding issue, completely bypassing the LERO's relational protocols. This is culture leakage. The external bureaucracy overwrites internal empathy, dictating a clinical response where a relational one was required. Prioritizing external risk compliance over internal relational protocols guarantees that the individual at the front door is not served. The mission fails at the point of contact. Mature LEROs operate in a state of unconscious competence. Staff instinctively execute high-level systemic work, protect boundaries, and guide peers without referencing a corporate manual. Eventually, external auditing bodies, like Investors in People, enter the ecosystem to accredit these organizations. In a healthy LERO, these accreditations are used retrospectively. The organization does the work organically, and the external framework simply categorizes and documents what is already happening. The auditor does not dictate new behaviors. Contrast this with organizations that panic under pressure. They alter their native operations, forcing staff to adopt artificial behaviors just to tick boxes for an impending audit. If external validation is allowed to design the culture rather than document it, the authentic relational dynamics that actually drive recovery evaporate. This brings us to the certification fallacy. Rapidly professionalizing sectors often adopt ubiquitous corporate training programs simply because they are common, not because they are effective. It is analogous to the early days of personal computing. Human resources departments didn't know how to identify good IT engineers, so they relied on standard Microsoft certifications. Everyone adopted the standard paperwork, even when far superior, natively adapted systems existed elsewhere. This chart highlights a critical management risk. Organizations begin to weight formal certifications far more heavily than actual relational efficacy. This creates scenarios where a staff member underperforms on the front line, breaking relational protocols, but justifies their position by pointing out that they hold a certified qualification on paper. This behavior sows confusion. It causes leadership to doubt their own internal standards, initiates conflict, and ultimately splits the management team. Clinical or corporate HR credentials do not automatically translate to effectiveness in a specialized lived experience environment. Confusing a piece of paper with actual competence destroys organizational accountability. It breaks the trust of the workforce and allows poor practice to hide behind compliance. Leadership must actively protect the heart of the organization from this bureaucratic colonization. Returning to our systemic model, the solution is structural. Leadership builds the container, a dedicated, culturally protected space wrapped around the entire ecosystem, specifically designed for internal development and certification. This container explicitly rejects the rigid, colonizer mentality of strict classroom schedules and theoretical examinations. It replaces rigidity with the Ubuntu approach. Learning happens asynchronously and organically. Staff develop their skills at their own pace, deeply rooted in the community. Instead of ticking boxes on standardized tests, staff build portfolios of evidence based on actual, daily workplace scenarios and peer interactions. By utilizing this protected container, the organization achieves a crucial balance. It produces the documented evidence required to satisfy external institutional compliance without ever compromising the LERO's internal developmental rhythm. Sustaining this container requires a unified, native onboarding pipeline. Disparate training requirements, rigid confidentiality agreements, and standard HR protocols must be shifted into a single, cohesive internal process. The golden rule of LERO management is this: do not force the workforce to translate their lived experience into the language of corporate paperwork. The design on screen shows the inverse imperative. Compliance serves the culture. Leadership must engineer the corporate paperwork so that it serves and validates the lived experience, not the other way around. True organizational competence in a recovery environment is measured by demonstrated relational efficacy. It is not measured by institutional sign-offs. Securing the future of specialized recovery cultures is not a passive HR function. It is an active, daily discipline of boundary setting against bureaucratic creep.